So how is Protocol Article 2 engaged, and when can we say that a breach of this commitment has occurred? I'm going to set out an example of how we test this using a series of questions. Remember, we need to ask 4 key questions. Firstly, does the right, safeguard or equality of opportunity protection fall within the relevant part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? Secondly, was the right, safeguard or equality of opportunity protection underpinned by EU law, binding on the UK and given effect in Northern Ireland law on or before the 31st of December 2020? Thirdly, has there been a diminution in the right, safeguard or equality of opportunity protection on or after the 1st of January 2021? And finally, is the diminution as a result of the UK's withdrawal from the EU? We will look at the Nationality and Borders Act 2022 and its impact on the right of victims of human trafficking as a practical example of how Protocol Article 2 might be engaged. Section 68 of the Nationality and Borders Act seeks to disapply requirements of the EU Human Trafficking Directive to the extent it is incompatible with the Act. Using our test, we can ask, are the rights of victims of trafficking protected under the relevant part of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? The answer is yes, for a number of reasons. Firstly, the right of victims to remember and contribute to a changed society is recognised in this chapter of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Victims of trafficking are a subset of victims. Secondly, the rights of victims of trafficking also fall within the right to equal opportunity in all social and economic activity in this chapter of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Thirdly, there is also a commitment to civil rights in the relevant chapter of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. The Commissions are reading this commitment as including rights under the European Convention on Human Rights, which are underpinned by EU law. Article 4 of the European Convention on Human Rights relating to the prohibition of slavery and forced labour encompasses a prohibition on human trafficking. Was the right, safeguard or equality of opportunity protection underpinned by EU law? Well, the answer is yes here. The EU Trafficking Directive provides for a number of rights and safeguards relating to trafficked victims. Article 1 of the Trafficking Directive also highlights the gendered impact of trafficking and acknowledges that men and women are often trafficked for different reasons. It also provides rights and safeguards in respect of child victims. Was it given effect in Northern Ireland law on or before the 31st of December 2020? Yes. The directive is given effect in Northern Ireland law in various measures, including the Human Trafficking and Exploitation, Criminal Justice and Support for Victims Act Northern Ireland 2015. Has there been a diminution in the right, safeguard or equality of opportunity protection on or after the 1st of January 2021? The Commissions have identified several clauses of the Nationality and Borders Act that are potentially incompatible with the Trafficking Directive and which may reduce protections in domestic legislation. For example, the Act requires that late compliance with trafficking information notices without good reason must be taken as damaging to a victim's credibility. The Commissions have raised concerns that this may not be compliant with the EU Trafficking Directive. Is the diminution as a result of the UK's withdrawal from the EU? Well, prior to Brexit, the UK as a member state was required to give effect to the principle of supremacy of EU law. Therefore, any UK Act, secondary legislation and guidance would have had to have been compatible with the provisions of the EU Trafficking Directive prior to the UK leaving the EU. The Commissions had recommended that the Nationality and Borders Bill be amended to avoid a potential breach of Protocol Article 2. So this highlights the relevant questions to ask to establish a potential breach of the Protocol Article 2 commitment. How do we know when the keeping pace commitment of Protocol Article 2 is engaged? I'm going to set out how we determine this using a practical example. One of the Protocol Annex 1 Equality Directives is the Racial Equality Directive. Under the Protocol, where one of the Annex 1 Equality Directives is amended or replaced by the EU on or after the 1st of January 2021, Northern Ireland law must be updated or keep pace to reflect any enhancements to the rights or safeguards in those directives. Therefore, if the provisions of the Racial Equality Directive are amended or replaced by the EU, Northern Ireland law must keep pace to reflect any enhancements to this directive. In January 2022, a review of the Race Equality Directive was launched by the European Commission. The purpose was to identify potential gaps in protections and measures to address these gaps. Therefore, there is a likelihood that changes to the Race Equality Directive may be proposed by the EU in the near future. Both Commissions responded to this review. In their responses, the Commissions highlighted limited progress to consolidate, strengthen and clarify existing equality protections and gaps in EU law. For example, in relation to multiple and intersectional discrimination, race hate crime, algorithmic discrimination, and recommended improved data collection. Monitoring of the Racial Equality Directive for any proposed changes following the EU review is essential. This is because Northern Ireland law will have to keep pace with any changes by the EU to the Racial Equality Directive that enhances protections. It should be noted that other EU laws that are not one of the 6 equality directives in Protocol Annex 1 and which underpin the relevant rights, safeguards and equality of opportunity provisions in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement are fixed as of 31st of December 2020. Therefore, there is no requirement under Protocol Article 2 to amend or update domestic law to take account of any subsequent changes to such EU measures. However, as best practice, Northern Ireland departments could choose to voluntarily align with future EU laws that strengthen equality and human rights protections, even if not required to do so under the protocol, so as to increase protections for different equality groups in Northern Ireland. I'm going to set out another example of how we determine if the Keeping Pace commitment under Protocol Article 2 is engaged, using the Pay Transparency Directive as a practical example. The EU Commission has proposed a Pay Transparency Directive. The new directive will strengthen the principle of equal pay between men and women by providing greater pay transparency and effective enforcement. It will also introduce measures to improve pay transparency, including new reporting requirements on the gender pay gap to apply to larger employers and better access to justice for victims of pay discrimination. The Directive on Equal Treatment of Men and Women in Matters of Employment is listed in Annex 1 of the Protocol. Where one of the Protocol Annex 1 Equality Directives is amended or replaced by the EU on or after the 1st of January 2021, Northern Ireland law must be updated or keep pace to reflect any enhancements to the rights or safeguards in those directives. Therefore, to the extent that the proposed Pay Transparency Directive updates or amends this directive, there is a duty to update Northern Ireland law to take account of this change. However, as best practice, Northern Ireland departments could choose to voluntarily align with future EU laws that strengthen equality and human rights protections, even if not required to do so under the protocol, so as to increase protections for different equality groups in Northern Ireland.